Vampire King sees human Nanny hiding his injured baby prince. The truth he learns breaks him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. The sun had long set, and the massive stone walls of the castle loomed high against the night sky, casting long shadows over the courtyard. Inside, the vampire king, Lucien Voss, sat on his throne, his eyes glowing faintly in the dimly lit room. His gaze was sharp and cold, a reflection of his centuries of ruling and the power he wielded over all who lived within his kingdom. Yet, tonight, his mind was preoccupied with something other than his kingdom. His son, Prince Adrian, had been acting strangely, and Lucien knew that something was wrong. He had heard whispers, and though he rarely paid attention to rumors, tonight they felt more pressing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Lucien's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. His most trusted servant, a human nanny named Clara, entered, carrying the prince in her arms. Lucien's eyes narrowed as he studied her. Clara had been with them for months, always kind, always gentle with his son. But there was something in the way she held the young prince tonight, something protective and fearful, that immediately caught his attention. "Clara, what's happened to him?" Lucien's voice was low, but it carried an undeniable authority. Clara paused, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly as she set the prince down on a velvet chaise lounge. He fell, my lord," Clara said softly, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't want to worry you, but he's hurt, and I didn't know what else to do." Lucien's gaze softened as he knelt beside his son, his sharp eyes taking in the bruises and the faint bloodstains on Adrian's clothes. "Why didn't you bring him to me sooner?" Lucien's voice was a mixture of frustration and concern. Clara bit her lip, clearly torn. "I didn't want you to know. I thought I could fix it. I didn't want to make you angry." Lucien's heart sank. He had been away for so long, wrapped up in matters of state and power, and now, seeing his son in pain, he realized how much he had failed to notice. The truth of Clara's words hit him harder than he expected. He had been blind to her struggles and to Adrian's needs. As he examined his son, Lucien noticed something strange. A faint glow radiated from the prince's wounds, something that was not natural. Lucien's eyes widened. "What is this?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Clara looked at him, her face filled with sorrow. "I didn't want you to know, but there's something inside of him that I can't explain. It's a curse, my lord." Lucien's breath caught in his throat. "A curse?" He glanced at Clara, his eyes piercing her. "What do you mean?" Clara hesitated, then slowly spoke. "It's a curse from my family's past. I didn't know it would affect him, but I think it's the reason he's been so ill." Lucien stood up, his mind racing. He had known that there were secrets in Clara's past, but this was more than he had ever imagined. He took a step back, his eyes narrowing. "What kind of curse?" Clara bowed her head, unable to look him in the eye. "I don't know, my lord. But I have to tell you, I think the prince's condition is more dangerous than we thought. If something isn't done soon, She couldn't finish the sentence. Lucien's thoughts were a whirlwind. His son, the heir to the throne, cursed? This was beyond anything he had prepared for. And Clara, his most trusted caretaker, had been hiding this from him all along. The truth of what he had learned broke him. He had trusted Clara, and she had kept this from him. He had trusted that she would protect his son, but now he saw that she, too, was trapped in this web of secrets. As Lucien turned to face Clara, the weight of his responsibility pressed down on him. His kingdom, his son, and now, his caretaker, all tied up in a mystery that threatened everything. He had to find the truth, no matter the cost. But the question remained, could he trust Clara to help him, or had her own past already doomed them all? The tension in the room was thick. Lucien Voss, the vampire king, stood motionless beside his son, Prince Adrian. His mind was racing, but his body remained still, as if holding onto the last remnants of control. Clara, the human nanny, stood by the door, her face pale and filled with worry. She had never imagined it would come to this. Her secret, the curse that had plagued her family for generations, now laid bare before the king. She had kept it hidden for so long, hoping against hope that it would never affect the prince. But now, it was clear that there was no escaping the truth. Lucien turned his gaze toward her, his amber eyes piercing. The weight of his stare was almost too much to bear, but Clara stood her ground. She had nothing left to hide. "Clara," Lucien said quietly, his voice soft but dangerous. "What is this curse? And why didn't you tell me?" Clara swallowed hard, her throat dry. She had never imagined it would come to this, never thought that the king himself would demand answers. "My lord," she began, her voice trembling. "This curse, it comes from my bloodline. It's something I've been running from my entire life." Lucien's expression hardened, but he said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "It's an ancient curse, my lord. One that was cast long ago by a powerful witch in my family's past. It was meant to trap us, to make us pawns in a game we never agreed to play. My family has carried it for centuries, but we thought it had died with the last generation. I never knew it would reach the prince." Clara's words hung in the air, the gravity of her confession sinking in. Lucien's mind whirled. A curse tied to his son? It was unimaginable. He had spent centuries building his empire, protecting his family, and now this? He turned back to the prince, whose injuries seemed to worsen with every passing moment. The prince's body trembled slightly, the faint glow of his wounds flickering as if trying to resist the curse's hold. Clara's hands were shaking, but she didn't step forward. She stayed where she was, her eyes fixed on Lucien, waiting for his reaction. "What does this curse do?" Lucien finally asked, his voice low, barely above a whisper. It makes the one who bears it suffer," Clara replied, her voice cracking. "The prince, he will live, but he will never be free. The curse ties him to darkness, to the very thing that destroyed my family. He will never be truly safe, not until the curse is broken." And she hesitated, the fear evident in her eyes. "And only someone from my bloodline can break it. But it comes at a cost." Lucien turned sharply to face her, his eyes narrowing. "What kind of cost?" he demanded. Clara took a deep breath, her body tensing. "The curse requires a sacrifice, a life in exchange for the prince's freedom. Someone must give their life willingly to break the curse." Lucien felt the ground beneath him shift. A sacrifice? A life for his son? It was too much to process. His gaze softened as he looked at Clara, and in that moment, he realized just how deeply she had been affected by this curse. She wasn't just a nanny. She had been trapped in this web of darkness, just like his son. Clara looked at him with pleading eyes. "My lord, you must understand. I never wanted this. I never wanted to bring this curse into your life. But now that it's here, we have no choice. We have to find a way to break it before it consumes the prince." Lucien took a step back, his mind in turmoil. He had spent his entire life protecting his family, and now this. He had to make a choice, a decision that could change everything. "What do you propose we do?" he asked, his voice strained with uncertainty. Clara's eyes softened, and for the first time, she stepped closer to him. "We have to find the witch who cursed my family," she said. "Only she can lift it. But we must act quickly. The prince's time is running out." Lucien stood in silence, his thoughts a whirlwind of doubt, fear, and anger. How had he failed his son so completely? How had he missed the warning signs? But now was not the time for self-blame. He had a decision to make. He looked at Clara, then at his son. The choice before him was simple. Save his son, no matter the cost, or risk losing him forever. As the storm raged outside, Lucien knew that the path ahead would be fraught with danger, betrayal, and unimaginable sacrifice. But one thing was certain. He would stop at nothing to save his son. And if that meant sacrificing his own life, then so be it. The room was cold, the air heavy with the weight of the decision Lucien had just made. The vampire king stood motionless, his amber eyes fixed on Clara as she explained what needed to be done. His son, Prince Adrien, lay unconscious in the next room, still suffering from the effects of the curse that had long plagued Clara's bloodline. He had to make a choice now, one that could cost him more than he was willing to lose. Clara stood quietly by the door, her hands wringing together nervously. She knew the gravity of the situation. She had known it from the moment the curse was tied to Adrien, and now, her own bloodline's dark history had come full circle. Lucien turned away from her, his gaze sweeping over the walls of his throne room. The weight of centuries of power, of being the ruler of all vampires, seemed to bear down on him in this moment. His empire, his legacy, his son, everything was at risk. "We find the witch," Lucien said finally, his voice cold, resolute. Clara nodded, relief flashing in her eyes. "Yes, my lord. We have no time to waste." They both knew the witch was the key, but she had disappeared long ago, vanishing into the shadows of history. The only way to find her was to follow a trail of ancient magic that had long been hidden from mortal eyes. Lucien looked at Clara. He had trusted her for months, and yet she had hidden the truth from him. Why? Why hadn't she told him about the curse? His thoughts were interrupted as the heavy doors to the throne room creaked open, and one of his guards entered, bowing low before him. "Your Majesty," the guard said, his voice trembling. "Prince Adrien, his condition has worsened." Lucien's heart skipped a beat. He had hoped the prince would improve, that time would heal his wounds, but the curse was more powerful than he had imagined. "Show me," Lucien ordered, his voice barely a whisper. He turned to Clara, who had remained silent, watching the exchange. Without another word, they followed the guard down the long hallway, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the stillness. As they reached Adrien's chambers, Lucien's eyes fell on his son, lying motionless on the bed, his pale skin glowing faintly. The prince looked as if he were trapped in a dreamless sleep, his breathing shallow, his pulse weak. "We have no time," Clara said urgently, stepping forward. "We must leave now." Lucien nodded grimly, his jaw clenched. He had never felt so helpless. The prince was his blood, his flesh, and yet there was nothing he could do to save him. He turned to the guard. "Prepare the horses. We leave at once." The guard nodded and rushed out of the room. Lucien turned back to Clara. "Tell me what I need to do." Clara hesitated for a moment, then spoke softly. "We need to go to the ancient ruins near the forest. The witch has hidden herself there, protected by powerful magic. Only the ones who carry the curse can pass through the barriers. It's the only way to reach her." Lucien's eyes hardened. "Then we go? Lead the way." They left the castle under the cover of night, the sound of hooves thundering across the gravel road as they headed for the forest. The journey was long, and Lucien could feel the tension building with every passing minute. He had spent his entire existence avoiding the dark magic of his ancestors, and now, it was the only thing that could save his son. As they entered the dense forest, the air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The trees loomed above them like silent sentinels, their branches twisting into the sky. The deeper they went, the more Lucien felt a strange pull, a sensation he could not explain. It was as if the forest itself was alive, aware of their presence. Clara led the way, her steps steady despite the growing unease in the air. Lucien's mind was focused solely on his son, on the curse that threatened to take everything from him. He had never been one to believe in fate, but now, as they ventured further into the heart of the forest, he couldn't help but wonder if this was his destiny. They arrived at the ruins just as dawn began to break, the first light of day casting long shadows across the stone structures. Clara turned to Lucien, her face pale. "We are here." Lucien dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the ruins. The air was thick with ancient magic, and he could feel it pressing against his skin. Clara took a deep breath and stepped forward, touching the stone with her fingertips. "We are not welcome here," she said quietly. "The witch will test us." Lucien nodded. He was ready. Whatever it took, he would save his son. "Let her test us," he said, his voice cold with determination. "I will do whatever it takes to break this curse." Clara nodded, stepping back. The air around them seemed to shift, and Lucien felt the familiar pull of magic. It was as if the forest was alive, watching them, waiting for their next move. The time for hesitation was over. He would face whatever came next, but he would not fail. Not this time. The air in the ancient ruins felt heavy, thick with the scent of magic that had long been forgotten by time. Lucien stood tall, his piercing amber eyes scanning the crumbling stone structures around them. The atmosphere was oppressive, as if the very walls were holding secrets that could tear apart anyone daring to uncover them. Clara was ahead of him, her face pale, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the weathered stone. The weight of the situation pressed down on them both, but Lucien's resolve was unwavering. He had come this far, and nothing would stop him from saving his son. The ruins seemed to pulse with life, a low hum vibrating through the air as if the forest itself was alive, watching them. Clara turned to Lucien, her voice barely a whisper. "This is it. The witch is close." Lucien nodded, but the uncertainty in his chest remained. He had come to rely on Clara's knowledge of the curse, but now, as they stood in the heart of this ancient place, he could feel the danger that lurked just beyond their reach. "We must be ready for anything," he said, his voice low and commanding. Clara nodded but said nothing. She had heard the stories, the warnings of the witch who had placed the curse on her family. A being so powerful, so ancient, that even the most skilled of sorcerers feared her. They continued forward, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The path ahead seemed to grow darker, the shadows of the trees stretching out like long fingers, blocking the faint light of dawn. As they reached the center of the ruins, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble, a low rumble that seemed to shake the very earth. Clara stopped, her eyes wide with fear. "She knows we are here," she said, her voice shaking. Lucien's grip on his sword tightened. He could feel it too, the magic in the air, thick and oppressive. "Stay close," he commanded, stepping forward with purpose. The ruins opened up into a large stone circle, the center of which was a strange altar. It was carved with intricate runes, ancient symbols that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly glow. At the altar, a figure stood motionless, cloaked in shadows. Her presence was commanding, yet she seemed to blend into the darkness around her, like a part of the very ruins. "So, you have come." The witch's voice was soft, yet it carried a weight that made the air around them grow colder. Lucien took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "I have come to break the curse that binds my son," he said, his voice steady. The witch tilted her head, her eyes glimmering with an unnatural light. "And what makes you think you can?" Her voice was laced with amusement. "You, a mere king, think you can undo the work of centuries?" Lucien's jaw clenched, but he refused to back down. "I will do whatever it takes," he said. "I will not let my son suffer any longer." The witch chuckled softly, the sound like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "You are willing to sacrifice everything for him, aren't you?" She stepped closer, her form materializing from the shadows. "But what will you sacrifice, Vampire King? What are you willing to give up to save the boy?" Lucien felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He knew the answer. He had already given up so much in his life, his humanity, his family, his soul. But to lose his son was something he could not bear. "I will give whatever it takes," he said, his voice unwavering. The witch studied him for a long moment, her eyes glowing with an ancient, eerie light. "Very well," she said finally. "But the cost will be great." She raised her hands, and the air around them seemed to shimmer with dark energy. The runes on the altar began to glow brighter, and the ground trembled again, as if the entire forest was awakening. "You seek to break the curse, but know this: one life must be given in exchange. You cannot save him without sacrificing something of equal value." Lucien's heart clenched. He had known this moment would come. He had known there would be a price, but the reality of it hit him like a blow to the chest. "What do you mean?" he demanded. The witch's smile was cold, almost cruel. "The curse can only be broken by the death of the one who carries it. It is the law of this magic. You can save your son, but you must lose something in return." Lucien's mind raced. The weight of her words settled in his chest like a stone. He had fought for so long, built his empire, protected his people, and now, to lose it all for his son? "I would sacrifice my life," he said, his voice fierce. "If that is what it takes, I will give it." The witch's eyes narrowed. "Your life is not enough," she said. "The curse requires more. It demands a soul." Lucien's heart skipped a beat. A soul. The price was steeper than he had imagined. But he would not back down. He would do anything for Adrian. "Take mine," he said, his voice filled with resolve. "I will give you my soul. Just save my son." The witch stepped closer, her dark cloak billowing around her. "Your soul is not for me to take," she said softly. "But if you are willing to make that sacrifice, I will break the curse. The choice is yours, Vampire King." Lucien turned to Clara, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in what felt like an eternity. He saw the fear and sadness in her eyes, but also something else, understanding. She knew what he had to do. She knew the cost. Lucien took a deep breath. The decision had been made. He would sacrifice everything to save his son. He would not allow the curse to take Adrian from him. Do it, Lucien said, his voice steady and unwavering. Break the curse. The witch raised her hands, the air crackling with dark energy. So be it, she whispered. The runes on the altar flared with a blinding light, and Lucien felt the magic surge around him. The ground beneath them cracked open, and for a moment, everything went dark. When the light finally faded, Lucien stood alone. The witch was gone, the ruins silent once more. The curse was broken, and yet, Lucien knew that the cost had been far greater than he had anticipated. His son was safe, but at what price? The light from the witch's spell faded, leaving the ancient ruins in eerie silence. Lucien stood alone, his heart pounding in his chest as he struggled to comprehend the weight of what had just happened. His son was no longer suffering. The curse that had bound him for so long was gone. But at what cost? His mind raced back to the moment of the witch's final words, when she had demanded more than his life, more than his very soul. He had given it all, and now, standing in the aftermath of the dark ritual, he wasn't sure if he had made the right choice. Had he done enough to save his son? Or had he traded away everything that truly mattered in the process? He glanced at Clara, who stood a few paces away, her face pale but resolute. She had witnessed the sacrifice, had seen him give everything for Adrian. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, he could see the understanding in her gaze. She knew what this would cost him, and perhaps, in some way, she felt the weight of it as well. It's done, Lucien said quietly, his voice heavy with the realization of his decision. Clara nodded slowly, her expression softening. Yes, it's done. The words echoed in his mind, but they did little to soothe the turmoil within him. The price had been paid, but would it be worth it? Lucien felt the darkness that had been lifted from Adrian's life, but it was now pressing against his own heart. His soul, his very essence, felt like it was fading, slipping away from him, as if the curse had left an irreversible mark. He could no longer deny it. The sacrifice had been made. Adrian was free, but at what cost to him? The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. The very thing that had once made him powerful, the thing that had allowed him to rule as the vampire king, was now slipping from his grasp. Lucien staggered, his vision blurring as the weight of the loss seemed to drain him of his strength. He clenched his fists, his body shaking as he fought against the overwhelming sense of emptiness that washed over him. He had saved his son, but the price was steep, and Lucien wasn't sure he could bear the consequences. Lucien, Clara's voice was soft, but it cut through his haze of thoughts. He looked at her, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and confusion. You did it. You saved him, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Lucien opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He didn't know how to explain what he was feeling. How could he? How could anyone understand the weight of sacrificing one's very soul for the sake of love? He had given everything to save his son, but in doing so, he had lost himself. Adrian was free, and Lucien had no idea how he would live with the consequences. I gave everything, Lucien whispered, his voice hollow. Clara stepped forward, her eyes filled with compassion. You saved him, she repeated, placing a hand on his shoulder. And that's what matters. Lucien wanted to believe her. He wanted to find comfort in her words, but the emptiness inside him was too great. The very thing that had once given him power, his immortal soul, was now lost, leaving him nothing but a shadow of the man he once was. What happens now? Lucien asked, his voice barely audible. Clara's eyes softened. Now we go back, she said quietly. We return to the castle. We take Adrian home. The words were simple, but they carried a weight Lucien wasn't sure he could carry. The road ahead seemed uncertain, the future unclear. He had saved his son, but in doing so, he had lost himself. The vampire king who had once ruled with iron will and unyielding power was no more. In his place stood a man who had sacrificed everything for the sake of love. And now, he would have to live with the consequences. Lucien turned away from Clara, his gaze settling on the distant horizon. The sky was dark, heavy with the weight of impending change. He had given up everything for Adrian. And now, he had to face the future, uncertain of what it would hold for him and for his son. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. Lucien would do whatever it took to protect Adrian. He had sacrificed everything for his son, and no matter what the cost, he would ensure that Adrian's future was free of the curse that had haunted him for so long. Together, they would face the unknown, and together, they would move forward, no matter the cost. Lucien walked through the darkened halls of the castle, his footsteps echoing in the silence that had settled over him. The weight of what he had sacrificed was crushing, and every step he took seemed heavier than the last. His son, Adrian, was safe, but the price he had paid haunted him. His soul, the very thing that had given him power and immortality, was gone. What was left of him now? A hollow shell, bound only by the duty to protect his son. He passed the door to Adrian's chambers and paused. Inside, the prince lay sleeping, his pale face peaceful for the first time in weeks. The curse that had bound him was broken, but Lucien couldn't shake the feeling that his own life was slipping away. His thoughts drifted to Clara, who had been by his side through everything. She had helped him, guided him, and yet Lucien couldn't help but feel the distance growing between them. The sacrifice he had made was too great, and he didn't know if he could ever return to the man he once was. Clara had stood beside him when the curse was lifted, but now, he was not sure how to bridge the gap between them. She had seen him at his lowest, and perhaps she had even seen him as weak. His immortality was gone. Would she still look at him the same way? Lucien took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Clara was sitting by Adrian's side, her eyes tired but calm. She looked up as he entered, her face softening when she saw him. "He's resting," Clara said quietly. "He will be all right." Lucien nodded, but the words did little to soothe him. "And me?" he asked softly. Clara looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" she asked. Lucien walked closer, his gaze never leaving Adrian's sleeping form. "I've given everything for him," he said, his voice heavy. "But what about me? Clara? What happens to me now?" Clara stood slowly, her face filled with a mixture of concern and sadness. She walked over to him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand the man standing before her. "You did what you had to do," she said softly. "You saved him." Lucien shook his head. "But at what cost?" He turned to face her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know who I am anymore." Clara took a step closer, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "You're still the same man who saved your son, the same man who fought for him." Lucien closed his eyes, his breath shaky. "But I don't have anything left, Clara. No soul, no power. What am I without that?" Clara's fingers tightened on his arm. "You're still you, Lucien. You're still the father who loves his son. You're still the man who sacrificed everything for him. That's who you are." Lucien opened his eyes and met her gaze. Her words were like a balm to his aching heart, but they didn't erase the emptiness that lingered within him. "I don't know how to live without it," he whispered. Clara took a deep breath, her expression softening. "Then you'll learn, Lucien. You've always learned. And this time, you'll learn how to live with what you've done, not for what you've lost." Lucien stared at her for a long moment, as if searching for some kind of reassurance. But there was no magic word, no spell that could make him whole again. There was only the truth. He had given everything for his son, and now, he had to find a way to live with that. Clara's hand slid down his arm, and she stepped back, her eyes filled with empathy. "We all have to live with what we've done, Lucien. But it doesn't mean we stop living." Lucien stood there in silence, her words sinking deep into him. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps he could still find a way to live, even without the power he had once wielded. He looked back at Adrian, his son who was now free from the curse that had tormented him for so long. Lucien could feel the love he had for his son, a love that had been the driving force behind every decision he had made. It was that love that had led him to this moment. It was that love that would guide him forward. He turned back to Clara, who was watching him with quiet understanding. She had been a part of his life for so long, and yet, now, it seemed that their paths were diverging. He wasn't the man he had been when they first met, and neither was she. They had both changed, but that didn't mean they couldn't move forward, together. Lucien took a deep breath, letting the weight of the past settle in his chest. "I don't know what comes next," he said quietly, "but I'll find my way." Clara nodded, her eyes warm with unspoken understanding. "We all will," she said softly. Lucien looked back at Adrian, his son now free of the curse, and for the first time since the sacrifice, he felt a small flicker of hope. Perhaps the future was uncertain, but at least he still had the one thing that mattered most, his son. And with that, he knew he could face whatever came next. The sun had just set, casting an eerie, golden glow over the castle grounds as Lucien paced restlessly in the garden, his thoughts a whirlwind of uncertainty and unanswered questions. The events that had unfolded in the past days had changed everything. His soul was gone. His son was free from the curse, but Lucien couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he still hadn't fully grasped. What was the cost of saving his son? Could he truly live without his soul? And more than that, what did the future hold for him now? The cool evening air did little to calm the fire burning inside him. As he walked the winding path, his mind kept returning to Clara. She had been by his side through it all, guiding him, helping him, but there was an unspoken distance between them now. She had seen him at his lowest, and now, he wasn't sure where they stood. He couldn't ignore the fact that he had given up everything for Adrian's freedom, but in doing so, he had lost something vital, the very thing that had made him who he was. He stopped by a fountain, the water flowing gently as it reflected the dimming sky. The stillness reminded him of the hollow emptiness within. "You're lost," he murmured to himself, the words barely escaping his lips. He had never felt so adrift. The powerful king who had once ruled with an iron fist was now left to navigate a world without his immortality. His connection to the supernatural, his power, his very essence was slipping through his fingers. What was left of him? A soft voice behind him broke his thoughts. "Lucien." He turned to see Clara standing there, her expression soft, her eyes filled with concern. "You've been out here for hours." Lucien's eyes met hers, and for a moment, he saw the faintest flicker of something. Understanding, perhaps, or pity. He knew she understood the weight of the decision he had made. She had seen it all, and yet, she was still here. "I don't know who I am anymore," he confessed, his voice raw with emotion. Clara walked closer, her eyes never leaving him. "You're still Lucien, the father who saved his son," she said gently. "That's who you are." Lucien shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "That man is gone," he said quietly. "What's left is just a shadow, a shell of who I used to be." Clara reached out, placing a hand on his arm. Her touch was warm, grounding. "You're not a shell," she said firmly. "You're still here. You're still breathing. And that's enough." Lucien looked at her, his chest tightening. He wanted to believe her, to find solace in her words, but the truth was, he didn't know if he could. Without his soul, without the power that had defined him for centuries, he felt like an empty vessel. He turned away from her, walking toward the stone wall that bordered the garden. "I sacrificed everything," he said, his voice low, almost to himself. "And now, I don't even know what to do with what's left." Clara followed him, her footsteps light against the stone. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," she said. "You've done what you needed to do for your son. You saved him. But now it's time to figure out what you want next. What you need." Lucien let out a long sigh, the weight of her words sinking in. He had been so focused on saving Adrian, so consumed by the idea of breaking the curse, that he had forgotten about himself. What did he want now? Was it possible to rebuild, to find purpose again, even without the immortality and power he had once wielded? Clara stopped beside him, her gaze soft but unyielding. "You're not alone, Lucien," she said quietly. "You have people who care about you. You have Adrian. And you have me." Lucien looked at her, a flicker of something deep within him. Hope, maybe, stirring. Could he allow himself to lean on her, to rebuild his life? Even if it wasn't the life he had once envisioned? Could he find meaning in the life he had left? His heart was heavy, but he felt a glimmer of something. Maybe it was hope, maybe it was acceptance. Whatever it was enough to make him want to keep going, to move forward, to find his way. "I don't know how to be that man again," he said, his voice quieter now. "But maybe I don't have to be." Clara smiled softly, her hand still resting on his arm. "You don't," she said gently. "You just need to be who you are now." The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time in a long while, Lucien felt the weight of his burden lift, even if only slightly. He wasn't sure what the future held, but maybe that was okay. Maybe he could find his way forward, piece by piece. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to hope. "I'll try," he whispered, turning to face her fully. "I'll try." Clara nodded, her smile warm. That's all anyone can do. And as the evening deepened, Lucien knew that the road ahead would not be easy. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it, no matter what it brought. Together, they would move forward. Together, they would rebuild. And for the first time, Lucien felt that maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to something resembling peace. The days that followed were not easy for Lucien. Each morning, he would wake up in the grand chambers of the castle, feeling the same emptiness that had consumed him since the curse was lifted. Adrien was recovering, the light in his eyes slowly returning, and Lucien couldn't deny the joy that seeing his son healed brought him. But even that joy seemed hollow now. Without his soul, without his immortality, everything felt distant, as though he was watching his life unfold through a fog. He had been a king, a ruler of all vampires, feared and respected, and now, he was nothing more than a man who had sacrificed his very essence for the sake of his son. As he sat by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Lucien couldn't help but feel lost. It was hard to admit, but it was the truth. He had built his entire existence around power, control, and an unyielding will to survive. But without those things, who was he now? Clara, who had stood by his side through it all, seemed to sense his turmoil. She had never stopped caring for him, even when he had pushed her away in his darkest moments. She was there now, helping him navigate this uncertain life. "You're thinking too much," she said one evening, her voice soft but steady as she approached him in the garden. Lucien turned to face her, forcing a smile. "What else is there to do?" he replied, his voice heavier than he intended. Clara stepped closer, her eyes searching his face as if she could read every thought swirling in his mind. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," she said, placing a hand on his arm. "You saved your son. That's what matters. And we'll figure out the rest together." Lucien looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she was just comforting him because she felt sorry for him. He had become a burden in her life, hadn't he? He had taken everything from her, her peace, her sense of normalcy. "I don't know how to move forward," Lucien confessed, his voice quiet, vulnerable. "I don't know who I am without my power, my soul." Clara's expression softened, and she gently squeezed his arm. "You are more than your power, Lucien. You always have been." His eyes searched hers, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe her. She had never been afraid of him. She had seen him at his worst and still stayed. It was a strange comfort, knowing that, despite everything he had lost, she was still here, standing by his side. "How do I live like this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara smiled softly. "One step at a time." Lucien chuckled bitterly. "One step at a time," he repeated, looking out over the garden. It seemed so simple, yet so impossible. The life he had known was gone, and now he had to build a new one from the ashes. It would take time, but for the first time, Lucien felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was faint, but it was there. As the weeks passed, Lucien began to adjust to his new reality. He no longer had the power that came with being the vampire king, but he had something else. He had his son. He had Clara. And slowly, the emptiness that had consumed him began to fade. He started spending more time with Adrien, watching as his son grew stronger each day, his laughter filling the halls once again. It was a reminder of what he had fought for, the love and future of his child. It was not the life he had expected, but it was a life worth living. Clara remained a constant presence in his life, offering quiet support and understanding as he navigated this new world without the weight of his former immortality. They spent hours talking, sometimes about nothing at all, but it was enough. It was more than enough. Lucien began to realize that the things he had once valued, the power, the fear, the control, were nothing compared to the simple joy of being with those he loved. The road ahead was still uncertain, and Lucien knew there would be challenges along the way. But for the first time in years, he felt like he had the strength to face whatever came next. And he wasn't alone. He had Clara. He had Adrien. And that was enough to give him the courage to move forward. As Lucien stood in the castle courtyard one evening, watching the stars begin to emerge in the night sky, he allowed himself to truly let go of the past. The man he had been, the king he had once been, was gone. But Lucien was still here. And that man, this man, could still make a difference in the world. He had made a choice. A choice for his son. A choice for himself. And that was a choice worth living for. The days following Lucien's decision were a mixture of quiet growth and unexpected challenges. The emptiness that had plagued him since the sacrifice of his soul had not disappeared overnight. But, slowly, he began to feel the weight of his new life lifting, piece by piece. Adrien was adjusting to the freedom that the curse's release had granted him. For the first time in his life, he could run and play without the shadow of that dark magic hanging over him. Lucien watched his son, now full of life, and a pang of guilt still gripped his heart. He had done the right thing, he knew that. But the loss of his immortality still felt like a piece of him had been stolen away. In the mornings, he would join Adrien outside, watching him run through the fields, his laughter ringing through the air. The innocence and joy in his son's voice stirred something deep within Lucien. Perhaps he could find joy again. Perhaps there was a future beyond the power he had once known. Clara remained by his side, offering a quiet strength that Lucien had come to rely on. She had been his anchor in the storm, the one person who never saw him as a monster or a king, but simply as a man who loved his son and was willing to sacrifice everything for him. She was still there, standing beside him, despite everything he had lost. It was in the silence between them, those moments when words were unnecessary, that Lucien felt the most. He had once been a ruler, feared by many, but now he was learning to be something else. Something human. One evening, as they sat together in the castle's courtyard, Clara spoke softly, her voice breaking through his thoughts. "You've changed," she said. Lucien looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "Changed?" he asked. Clara nodded, her gaze steady. "Not just in the way you've had to, but in the way you've allowed yourself to. You're more than just the vampire king now. You're learning to live." Lucien's heart tightened, a rush of emotions swirling within him. He had never thought of himself as more than his power. But Clara was right. He had been so consumed by his identity as a ruler, as a creature of darkness, that he had never allowed himself the luxury of living for anything other than survival. Now he was learning to live for something else, something he had long forgotten: love. "I don't know if I'm ready to live fully yet," Lucien confessed, his voice low. "There's still so much I feel I've lost. So much I've given away." Clara reached out, her hand gently brushing his. "You've lost a lot, Lucien. But what you've gained is just as important. Adrien is free. You're free. And you still have time. Time to rebuild. Time to find new purpose." Lucien turned his hand over, allowing her fingers to intertwine with his. For the first time, the weight of her words settled in his chest, not as a burden, but as a light, a possibility. As the days turned into weeks, Lucien began to realize something. The past, with all its darkness and regret, could not be erased, but it could shape the man he was becoming. He was no longer the ruler of all vampires. He was no longer the powerful being who had once commanded fear. He was simply Lucien, a father, a man who had lost everything but was learning, slowly, to live again. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the loneliness of it all crept in. But Adrien was there, growing stronger with every passing day, and Clara was there, a constant presence by his side. Together, they were building something new, something that didn't rely on power or immortality, but on the simple things. The things that made life worth living. One afternoon, as Lucien and Clara watched Adrien chase after a butterfly in the garden, Lucien felt a flicker of peace. His heart no longer felt heavy with regret. He was not who he had been before, and that was okay. In fact, it was better. He could see the future now, not as a king in a throne room, but as a father, a protector, and maybe, just maybe, a man who could learn to be happy. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Clara's voice broke through his thoughts. Lucien turned to look at her. Her eyes were soft, filled with a warmth that made him feel as though, despite everything, he could still belong to something. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is." And in that moment, with his son laughing and playing in the distance, Lucien realized that there was still so much beauty left in the world. Even without his power, even without his soul, the future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Lucien had found his way back to the light, and it was enough. The days passed quietly, the heavy silence that had once weighed on Lucien now replaced by a sense of fragile peace. The castle, which had once been filled with the echoes of power and fear, now echoed with the sounds of life. Laughter from Adrian, the soft murmur of conversation between Lucien and Clara, the steady rhythm of a life lived without the constant pressure of immortality. Lucien still found himself waking in the mornings with a faint sense of loss, but the emptiness in his chest was no longer overwhelming. He had started to feel like he was learning to breathe again, as if the world he had built without truly living was slowly being rebuilt with purpose and meaning. Adrian had come a long way since the curse was broken. His days were filled with running through the gardens, learning from the castle's teachers, and asking questions about the world that Lucien had never had the luxury of considering as a king. The innocence of his son's curiosity was a balm for Lucien's soul, and it reminded him of the joy he had once known before the burden of his crown had weighed him down. It was in moments like these, when Lucien watched Adrian play in the garden, that the realization hit him fully. He was not the man he had been before. He no longer had the power, nor the soul that had once been his anchor. But he had his son. He had Clara, and for the first time in years, that was enough. One evening, as they sat together on the castle's terrace, the three of them watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink, Lucien looked at Clara. Her presence had become a constant comfort, her quiet strength a steady presence by his side. She had been his guide through this strange new world he was navigating, and he found himself more grateful for her every day. "What happens now?" Lucien asked softly, his voice barely a whisper as he turned his gaze toward the horizon. Clara turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice gentle but curious. Lucien shrugged, his eyes distant as he stared at the fading light in the sky. "I've given everything for Adrian. I've broken the curse. But what do I do now? Who am I now?" Clara's gaze softened, and for a moment, there was silence between them, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Then she spoke, her voice steady and sure. "You are still Lucien. You are still Adrian's father. And you're still you." Lucien turned his head to look at her, his expression conflicted. "But I don't have what I had before. I don't have the power, the immortality. I'm just a man who made a sacrifice, and I'm not sure I can live with it." Clara reached over, placing her hand on his. The simple gesture sent a warmth through him, grounding him in the present. "You're not just a man who made a sacrifice, Lucien. You're a father who gave everything for his son, and that is worth more than any power." Lucien looked down at their hands, entwined on the table between them. He could feel the warmth of her touch, a comfort he had never known in his long existence. He had always been alone, even in the crowd of his own people. But now, with Clara by his side, he no longer felt like he was walking through the world blind. He had lost much, but he had also gained more than he had ever thought possible. "I still don't know how to live this way," he confessed, his voice quiet, almost lost in the evening air. Clara smiled, her expression kind. "You live it one day at a time, and you don't have to do it alone." Lucien looked up at her, his chest tightening. "I'm not sure what that looks like," he admitted. "But maybe I can learn." Clara nodded. "You already are." The days that followed brought small, quiet victories. Lucien spent more time with Adrian, teaching him what he could, sharing stories of the past, and listening to his son's endless questions about the world beyond the castle walls. There were moments of laughter, of pure, unguarded joy, and Lucien found himself starting to believe that perhaps he could have something resembling happiness again. With Clara's guidance, he began to take small steps toward rebuilding not just his life, but his sense of self. He started learning new things he had never had time for when he was a king. He found joy in simple things, like watching Adrian learn to read, or sitting with Clara as they shared stories over dinner. Lucien didn't know where the future would take him, but he no longer feared it. The man he had been, the king who had ruled with fear and power, was gone, and he had no desire to bring that version of himself back. The man he was becoming, though, was someone who could find meaning in the quiet moments. Someone who could love without the need for control or domination. Someone who could simply be present. Adrian had grown stronger, more confident, and Lucien's heart swelled with pride as he watched him. His son was free of the curse, free to live the life he deserved. And Lucien, for the first time in years, felt like he had a future too. A future with his son. A future with Clara. It was a future he could build, step by step, day by day. It wasn't the future he had once envisioned. It was better. And for the first time, Lucien felt hope. True, unshakable hope. The days blended together in a quiet, peaceful rhythm that Lucien never thought possible. The castle, once a fortress of power and fear, now felt like a home. He spent his time walking the halls, watching Adrien grow, and sharing simple moments with Clara. There were still moments of doubt, of course, when the weight of his lost soul would press down on him, or when the memories of his former life as a king would flare up, reminding him of the life he had sacrificed. But with each passing day, the emptiness inside him felt less overwhelming. He no longer defined himself by the power he once wielded, nor by the fear that had followed him throughout his existence. Now, he was simply a father, a man, a person learning to live again. One afternoon, as Lucien sat in the garden, watching Adrien play with the other children from the village, Clara approached him, her footsteps light on the gravel path. She sat beside him, her presence a steady comfort. "You've been quiet today," she remarked, her voice soft but filled with the warmth Lucien had come to rely on. Lucien turned his head slightly to look at her, his brow furrowing just slightly. "I was thinking," he said quietly, "about what comes next." Clara gave him a small, knowing smile. "You mean about finding your place in all of this?" Lucien nodded. "I feel like I'm still figuring it out," he admitted. "I gave up everything to save Adrien. But now that he's free of the curse, I'm not sure where I belong." Clara's eyes softened with understanding. She reached out and touched his arm gently. "You belong with him," she said, her voice steady, filled with the simplicity of truth. "You're his father. That's enough." Lucien looked down at her hand, then out toward the garden where Adrien was running, his laughter carried on the breeze. "It's more than that," Lucien murmured. "I want to do more for him. I want to be more than just someone who saved him." Clara nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You are more than that, Lucien. You're here, present, every day. You're teaching him, guiding him, just by being here." Lucien's heart swelled with emotion. He had been so focused on what he had lost that he hadn't truly realized the significance of what he still had. He had his son, and he had Clara. He wasn't alone. "I'm not sure how to do it," Lucien said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "How do I move forward when everything I knew is gone?" Clara smiled gently. "You take it one day at a time, just like you have been. You've already made the hardest decision of your life. Now you just live. For Adrien. For yourself." Lucien took a deep breath, letting her words sink in. It was strange, how simple it sounded, yet how difficult it felt. But Clara was right. The future was uncertain, and the past could never be undone. But he still had the power to shape what came next. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe that was enough. As the days continued to pass, Lucien found himself slowly stepping into the life he had once thought impossible. He spent more time with Adrien, teaching him about the world, helping him grow, and nurturing the bond between them. There were still moments when Lucien felt the ache of what he had lost, but they were fleeting, replaced by the quiet joys of fatherhood. It wasn't the life he had envisioned, but it was a good one. It was a life filled with love, purpose, and the promise of a future he could still shape. And then, one day, as Lucien was walking through the castle's library, his eyes caught something on the shelves, a book of ancient magic, one that he had once studied in the hopes of mastering his power. He had never opened it since the curse was lifted, and yet, in this moment, he felt a strange pull toward it. The desire to learn again, to understand magic not for the purpose of power, but for knowledge, for the sake of something deeper. He reached for the book, his fingers brushing over the worn pages, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of curiosity. Maybe he could learn something new. Maybe this was his path now, learning for the sake of understanding, not domination. It was a small step, but it felt significant. He didn't need to rule the world or command fear to find his place in it. He had a purpose. He had Adrien. And he had Clara, who had helped him see that he didn't need to be the man he once was to have a meaningful life. Lucien closed the book and set it down, a quiet smile on his face. He wasn't sure where this new path would lead, but he knew one thing. It was his choice now. He wasn't bound by the past anymore. The future was wide open, and for the first time in a long time, Lucien was ready to walk into it, step by step. Lucien's life had shifted in ways he hadn't expected. The days blurred together, and yet, As he stood by the window of his chambers, watching the sun set behind the distant hills, he realized that the small, ordinary moments were now the most meaningful. He no longer felt the need to constantly chase power, nor did he carry the heavy burden of his previous existence. Instead, he found solace in the simplicity of life. Adrian had grown stronger, and his laughter filled the castle again, as it had when he was a child. Lucien's heart swelled each time he saw his son run through the gardens, carefree and full of life. And Clara, who had been the anchor through everything, had become more than just a guide. She was his companion, his partner in this new life they were building. Every day felt like a new opportunity, a chance to rediscover what truly mattered. One morning, as Lucien walked through the castle grounds, he noticed Clara sitting by the fountain, her gaze lost in thought. She looked peaceful, but there was something different about her, a quiet intensity that caught his attention. As he approached, he could see the soft smile on her face, but there was something in her eyes, something that spoke of deep contemplation. "Clara?" Lucien asked, his voice gentle but filled with concern. She turned to him, her eyes softening. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice calm, "about the future, about what comes next." Lucien sat beside her, his gaze following the flowing water in the fountain. "What do you mean?" he asked. Clara sighed, her fingers tracing the edge of the stone. "I think it's time we stop living in the past. I know you've been focused on Adrian's well-being, but what about you, Lucien? You've given everything for him, but you still have a future. You don't have to keep carrying the weight of everything you've lost." Lucien turned to face her, her words sinking deep into him. "I've tried," he said quietly, his voice filled with uncertainty. "But I don't know how to move forward. Everything I knew, everything I was, is gone." Clara smiled softly, her gaze warm. "You don't have to be who you were before," she said. "You don't need power, and you don't need to carry the burdens of your past. You have a chance to create something new. For yourself. For Adrian. For both of us." Lucien's chest tightened as he listened to her, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. He had been so focused on what he had lost, on the empty space where his power had once been, that he hadn't allowed himself to consider what he could gain from this new life. He wasn't defined by his past anymore, and perhaps that was exactly what he needed. He was no longer the king. He didn't have the weight of an empire on his shoulders. He had the freedom to live, to rebuild. The thought was both daunting and exhilarating. "You're right," he whispered. "I've been afraid to let go. Afraid of what comes next." Clara placed a gentle hand on his arm. "The only way forward is to let go of the fear, Lucien. You can't control everything anymore. But that doesn't mean you're helpless." Lucien nodded slowly, the weight in his chest easing. It wasn't an easy decision to make, but the realization that he didn't have to carry everything alone, that there was more to life than the pursuit of power, was both freeing and humbling. Adrian's laughter echoed through the gardens again, and Lucien couldn't help but smile. His son was growing up, and Lucien wanted to be there for every moment of it, not as a king, but as a father who was still learning how to be a man. The future stretched out before him, uncertain and wide open. It wasn't the future he had planned for, but it was a future he could shape. And that was enough. Lucien stood, offering Clara a hand. "Let's go inside. Adrian's waiting." Clara took his hand, her smile full of warmth and understanding. Together, they walked toward the castle, their footsteps light on the gravel path. Lucien didn't know exactly where the path ahead would lead, but for the first time, he didn't feel lost. There was a sense of peace within him, a quiet certainty that the future would unfold as it should. The man he had been was gone, but the man he was becoming was someone he could live with. A father, a partner, a man, and that was enough. Lucien sat on the balcony of the castle, watching the last light of the day fade behind the mountains. The horizon was painted in shades of gold and purple, a beauty that reminded him of how much had changed in his life. It had been months since the curse had been broken, and since that day, he had learned what it meant to truly live. The path he had walked was no longer defined by fear and power, but by love, loss, and the quiet moments of peace he had never allowed himself to experience. Adrian was growing up, a vibrant young boy full of life, no longer burdened by the curse that had plagued him for so long. Lucien smiled as he watched his son play in the garden with Clara. His heart swelled with pride. The decision to break the curse had been the hardest of his life, but it had been worth it. He had saved his son, and in doing so, he had saved himself. In the beginning, Lucien had feared that without his power, without his immortality, he would lose everything that had defined him. But now, he understood that there was more to life than control or fear. There was joy in the small moments, in the quiet companionship of those who loved him. He had learned to embrace the present, to be content with what he had rather than mourning what he had lost. The weight of the past no longer held him down. He was no longer the vampire king, but he was something more important. He was a father, a protector, and a man learning to rebuild his life. Clara had been his steadfast companion through it all, never judging him, never asking for anything more than what he could give. She had shown him that there was strength in vulnerability, that it was okay to let go of the past and look to the future. And in turn, Lucien had learned how to be present, how to truly connect with the people he loved. As the weeks turned into months, Lucien found himself becoming more at peace with his new life. There were still challenges, of course, but they no longer felt insurmountable. Adrian's laughter, the warmth of Clara's touch, the beauty of the world around him, they were the things that mattered now. And as he stood up from the balcony and made his way toward the garden, he realized that for the first time in a long time, he was content. There was no longer a need to search for power or control. He had everything he needed right here, in the love of his son and the quiet understanding of Clara. As they sat together that evening, watching the stars begin to appear in the sky, Lucien felt a sense of peace settle over him. The future was no longer a terrifying unknown. It was a journey he would take with those he cared about, one step at a time. He no longer needed to be a king. He no longer needed to be immortal. He simply needed to be the man he had become, the man who had learned what it meant to love, to sacrifice, and to rebuild. And as the night grew darker, Lucien smiled. It wasn't the life he had once envisioned, but it was the life he had chosen. And it was enough.